Alright, Shalom. All praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh by Hashem Yahweh Shai. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of the great millstone, and honors and peace and blessings to the rest of the elect brothers in GMS and the rest of the brothers worldwide that believe in His truth and sincerity, honesty, and faith. Um, this is another video, another lesson, some more insight um, on Israelites in history. Okay, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into this article that I have up here, Israel Hill on the Appomattox. Okay, what this is dealing with is basically there was a community of freed slaves going back to the early 1800s, and there was a community that they had built, and this was in Virginia. As you can see, it's Prince Edward County, Virginia website, and basically they were freed by their master after his death, and they built a community based off of the properties that he had left them in his will. And these so-called blacks, they strived in the community. They had farms, they had different businesses going. All right, and they strive all the way up until the time of the American Civil War. So I'm gonna go into this information and bring it out for the elect and expound upon it with the scriptures. So this is Israel Hill on the Appomattox. It says Israel Hill on the Appomattox was a community in Prince Edward County that was made up of freed slaves who lived, married, were commercial successes, and even sued white members of Prince Edward County and won the lawsuits at least as frequently as they lost. Okay, it says Thomas Jefferson himself condemned slavery, but never believed that blacks and whites could live together peacefully. All right, it says, however, his nephew Richard Randolph was a socialist and morally opposed to the use of humans as slaves. And as was the custom in those days, Richard Randolph inherited his father's properties upon his death, but could not afford to free the slaves at that time because of the debts that his father still owed. Richard planned to free the slaves as soon as these debts were paid, yet vowed to free the slaves in his will should he die first. When Richard Randolph died at a very early age, around 26 years old, it was in his will that the slaves be freed and deeded 50 acres of land to begin their new lives. All right. It says Judith Randolph, despite that women were not allowed to make these kinds of decisions in those days, followed her husband's request, and about 10 years after Richard's death, 25 acres was deeded over to these families, and they were freed. Now the will said 50, but because the so-called white man is still the devil, no matter how nice he may appear, and like the scripture says, though he go crouching, okay, you still don't trust him. Only 25 acres were deeded as opposed to 50, you know. But as you can see through what I read, okay, this Richard Randolph, he had some kind of compassion for the slaves, so to speak, and they were able to build upon those different lands that they were given, okay, and his wife after his death saw that those things were taken care of. So it says Judith Randolph, despite that women were not allowed to make these kinds of decisions in those days, followed her husband's request, and about 10 years after Richard's death, 25 acres was deeded over to these families, and they were free. They chose to call their settlement Israel Hill because it was their promised land. Okay? It says they chose to call their settlement Israel Hill because it was their promised land. All right? Now, I'm pretty sure as slaves beneath underneath Richard Randolph, which he was probably more than likely, I haven't done deep history on the man, but I'm pretty sure he was a Christian, and he, believed in the Bible, and he probably believed in freeing, like in the law, it talks about freeing your servants and letting your servants go free after serving a certain amount of years underneath you. So that was probably where he based some of his decisions based off of, to free his slaves. And he probably told them about Israel and all of that. So the slaves chose, because it was illegal for, well, slaves couldn't read back then, first off. And because if a slave was caught reading the Bible, they were put to death. You know. Um, but basically, the slaves, whatever information they got from their master, they chose to call the settlement when they were freed Israel Hill. Okay, all right, because it was what their promised land. All right, so you see the spiritual aspect of this history that I'm going into. It says what makes this particularly impressive is that all of this occurred within 25 years after. It says all of this occurred within 25 years after the completion of the Revolutionary War. It says because the slaves had been told while Richard Randolph lived that this was his desire, this community of blacks was allowed to begin to grow their businesses while still considered slaves. All that they reaped, they were allowed to retain, which was a hardship on the widow Randolph, as she still had her husband's father's debt to pay off. However, this community developed a commercial following so that once they were finally free, they already had their customer base well established. These businesses were blacksmithing. Uh, 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 these businesses were blacksmithing, dairy or tobacco farming, carpentry, a general store, all the same businesses found in the white community. So, you had Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, I believe, in the 19 teens, in, in the 1920s. All right, around that time, until the so-called white man showed it was the devil and bombed it. There were. This is another example of a striving black community during the time of slavery. Okay, but because we're underneath these curses, all right, and according to the scriptures, all of these things were set up to fail according to the spirit of the Lord, and how he willed things. All right, I'm gonna read on. It says it was not all smooth sailing after their freedom was documented, and this basically means now the curses come into play. Okay, it was not all smooth sailing after their freedom was documented, because the rest of the South continued to rely quite heavily on slavery. There were times when a freed member of Israel Hill might have to buy his wife at an auction because she was still a slave, or a father had to see his children sold off at auction because his wife was still a slave. Recall that the children follow the status of their mother. As of today, when you're born, okay, the rights of the child, even born today in 2015, don't go to the father, although it's actually the father's child, okay, because you're based off of your father's sperm, your father's seed, but it goes to the woman, the mother. Say that goes back to slavery, okay. Now, before I finish reading these last two paragraphs, I want to pull some scriptures out, okay, because it talked about they would they build up their communities and things like that, but then the curses came into play. Okay, so this is the book of Deuteronomy chapter 20, and I'm gonna try to get as straight to the point as best as possible. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 15. It says, "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field." Whether you're in a city or any other part of the world, you're going to be cursed. Number one, cursed shall be thy basket and thy store. Going into your farmhouses, your businesses, okay? Going back to what I'm reading here, Israel Hill, okay? Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy kind and the flocks of thy sheep. Because although they built a community, they were still underneath these curses where they came to their children. And as I continue reading, it's going to continue to show you that everything that they had dealing with Israel Hill became cursed. All right. But I read about the children being taken away. Okay. All right. And that's because they were basically slaves. All right. Uh, Here we go. This is Deuteronomy 28 and 30, starting at 30. It says, "Thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build an house, and thou shalt not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and shalt not gather the grapes thereof." It says, "Thine ox shall be slain before thine eyes, and thou shalt not eat thereof. Thine ass shall be violently taken away from before thy face, and shall not be restored to thee. Thy sheep shall be given unto thine enemies, and thou shalt have none to rescue them. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thy hand." Okay? So going back to the article, because the mother was a slave, although the man may have been free from that community, his wife may have been a slave, because like it said, they may have been bought at the slave auction, but the children, wherever children they had, it belonged unto the mother. Okay? So by all rights at that time, okay, because she was still a slave, the children could be taken away, okay, and sold. All right, and there was no might, even though the so-called black man was so-called free on Israel Hill, and although they had businesses going, they had communities going, houses, and they were living good, there was no might. They had no power to oppose the white man when it came down to their own households. Why? Because of the curses. Okay? Because of the curses. So I'm going to read that again. Deuteronomy 28 and 32. "Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people," the so-called white man, the Edomites, "and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long." And they showed you that in the movie 12 Years a Slave. All right? It says, "And there shall be no might in thine hand. The fruit of thy land and all thy labors shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up. And thou shalt be only oppressed and crushed always, so that thou shalt be mad for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see." Okay? And that's going back to the curses. Okay? So I'm going to finish reading in this article. It says, "It was not all smooth sailing after their freedom was documented, because the rest of the South continued to rely quite heavily on slavery. There were times when a freed member of Israel Hill might have to buy his wife at an auction, and because she was still a slave, or a father had to see his children sold off at auction because his wife was still a slave, recall that the children followed the status of their mother." That's Deuteronomy 28:32. It says, "Freed blacks also own weapons." Now you say, "Oh, here goes some might. Here goes some might that these freed blacks have." Well, let's continue reading. It says, "Freed blacks also own weapons, which initially caused no concern for their white neighbors, at least not until the famous Nat Turner slave revolt in 1831. Okay? All right? You know? So, because no matter what the so-called white, it's like no matter what the so-called black man does underneath this so-called white man, all right, at the end of the day, he's still going to be oppressed. He's still going to be crushed, all right. And ultimately, a man in the spirit like Nate Turner or us in this day, the prophets, okay, those that believe in the scriptures and know they Israel, unless the Lord raises up a man to prophesy and ultimately sends back Yahweh Shai, there will be no might to give the nation of Israel, the so-called Black, Hispanics, and Native Americans, true peace and happiness on this planet Earth. Okay? The Lord, he has to bring back his prophets, he has to bring back his warriors, and ultimately he must bring back Yahweh Shai and give us the knowledge and wisdom and understanding of the Bible to deliver us. Okay? It says, "Preacher Turner led a revolt where he and other slaves killed many of the white inhabitants of his locality. When news of this reached Prince Edward County, there was suddenly concern that this could happen here. Guns were taken from the freed black community members for fear that they would be used to free the rest of the slaves in the county." Okay? So although they did have some kind of might, some kind of weaponry power, The so-called white men could still come into the community and take away their guns, man, and the blacks could do nothing about it. All right, because of those curses, man, there shall be no might in thine hand. Okay. It says, however, nothing untoward happened, and within a few years, the black community members were applying for and receiving licenses to own firearms once again. It says the former slaves built homes and shops, they married, sued each other over perceived and real issues. They even took on the white community when someone was less than honest with them. They pled their cases in court with white judges and white juries, and just as frequently won their cases, all on the merits of the case. It was an amazing time in Prince Edward County, and the sites where all this occurred are still here under new commercial and residential growth. Yeah, because the so-called white men came in and took over. Okay. Now let's see what happened after this so-called amazing time in Prince Edward County in Israel Hill. Okay. Let's see. Here we go. This is from a New York Times article back in 2005. By the way, it says Israel on the Appomattox. All right. I'm just going to read a couple. I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs from this. All right, so let's see what happened. It says, in the winter of his 99th year, Sam White looked out from his Virginia farmhouse by the railroad tracks across the gentle slope of Israel Hill, his home of 5 decades, and unto a world that was reminding him yet again what a remarkable life he had led. Right, because it was sweet, but eventually it was going to become bitter for Israel Hill. It says White was one of the few Americans left who personally remembered the revolution that his fellow Virginians had championed and the first years of the republic they had built. Now, early in 1863, the grandsons of those same Virginians were killed and dying in the scores of thousands to break up that union. Why? Because the Civil War took place. That's what ultimately broke up Israel Hill back then. It says the once glorious, now tragic history of its state and its country formed only the latest chapter in a life of paradox. On the one hand, Sam White was in many ways a typical Southerner of his time, if there was such a thing. He owned a farm, but only a small one. He, his father, and his 3 brothers had cleared their own land and built unpretentious but comfortable houses on it. Like 2/3 of the households in the South, White and his neighbors formed their tracks with little or no help from slaves. Um, it says Sam White's sons and daughters, nephews, nieces, and grandchildren could grow, raise, hunt, or catch much of the food they needed. They cut timber from the back sections of the 100 acres to construct houses and outbuildings, repair their fences, cook their meals, and keep warm during the winter. They earned cash to satisfy their other wants by raising tobacco and vegetables. So that's just a little history going into this family. But this is going to go into what happened afterwards. It says, like many other small landowners in the South, some of the men in the White family had found ways besides farming to earn money. A few worked at carpentry, coopering, or other crafts. 2 of Sam White's brothers, one of his sons, and a nephew or 2 had pulled cargo boats or bateaux filled with hogsheads of tobacco, which hogsheads is a weight, a measurement of weight, of tobacco and barrels of wheat down the nearby Appomattox River to market at Petersburg. In more recent years, some whites had taken work in the small tobacco factories of nearby Farmville, a growing center of trade for the area. Just now, though, there were fewer men than usual on Israel Hill, as almost everywhere else in the South. For by 1863, the Civil War had become what Abraham Lincoln had warned of, a remorseless revolutionary struggle consuming American citizen soldiers in staggering numbers. It says Sam White could not guess that the war's final drama would unfold on the very ground he looked out upon in 1863. General Robert E. Lee would fight his last major battle a day's march east of Israel Hill in April 1865. Lee would hold one final urgent meeting with the Confederate Secretary of War just 2 miles from the White Farm before he set out toward neighboring Appomattox Courthouse and Ulysses S. Grant would write to Lee later that day from the same place, suggesting that the Confederate general surrender. Nothing so dramatic. Excuse me. Let me scroll up a little bit. Okay, it says nothing so dramatic had happened in the neighborhood up to 1863 because, like I said, it was a prosperous time up until the Civil War. But even by then, the war had hit White and his friends hard. The Confederate Army had called perhaps a dozen men into its service from the little settlement of Israel Hill alone. You know, so that's just what I wanted to read from this article here. But as you can see, the Civil War, that's what took a toll on Israel Hill. Why? Because of the curses. Okay? Because that wasn't the promised land. You know, they called it Israel Hill because it was supposed to represent the promised land, okay, for the so-called blacks that was freed there, the Israelites that was freed there. But that's not the promised land, okay? Our promised land is back in the Middle East, which we're soon to get back in return. Okay, I got another scripture I do want to get. Leviticus chapter 26 and Leviticus chapter 26. Because now this is going into the curses. Let me find it. Bear with me for a second. Leviticus chapter 26 and all right, here we go. All right, Leviticus 26 and 19. It says, "And I will break the pride of your power." The pride of the power at that time was Israel Hill, because that was the promised land. That was the power for those freed blacks. It says, "And I will make your heaven as iron, and your earth as brass, and your strength shall be spent in vain," because they built up that community. But what happened? The Civil War happened, and war happened. Okay. It says, "For your land shall not yield an increase, neither shall the trees of the land yield their fruits. And if you walk contrary unto me, and will not hearken unto me, I will bring 7 times more plagues upon you according to your sins." Okay? And this happened in the land of Israel, okay? Going all the way back to 70 AD and through the different captivities before then, but even during slavery. Because we had communities, we built them up, right? But because we weren't under the knowledge, the wisdom, the understanding as a whole of knowing that we're Israel, and I'm pretty sure those days were eating pork, okay, hog, okay, other abominable foods, you know. They probably wasn't keeping the Sabbath because they had the farm land, just to make ends meet, you know, because it was a small community. But the point was, the Lord said He would break the pride of your power. That was Israel Hill back then. So the Lord broke it up. Okay? So let's see what happened. This is from another article from the History News Network. Let's see. What's the actual... Well, this is actually going to Israel Hill. But it's an interview with Bancroft winner Melvin Patrick Ely. Okay, here we go. It says in March, Melvin Patrick Ely, a professor of history and black studies at the College of William and Mary, was awarded the Bancroft Prize for Israel on the Appomattox, a southern experiment in black freedom from the 1790s through the Civil War. Southern experiment. It says the book tells the story of free African Americans in a Virginia county and their relationship to white people. The Bancroft Committee cited the book as a model work of local history. Okay, So let's see what happened to Israel on the Appomattox um, du during the Civil War. All right, bear with me for 1 second. Right, here we go. It says, "What changes did the Civil War bring to Israel Hill?" It says, "Now everyone knows that free black men in Virginia became subject to the military draft." Okay, and like I said in the last article, a couple dozen men were drafted into the Civil War. It says, "Not everyone knows that free black men in Virginia became subject to the military draft more than a year before white men did. The blacks were sent to all sorts of places to perform menial tasks for the Confederate Army." All right. It says, building building fortifications and the like. Perhaps a dozen men from the little community of Israel Hill were drafted and put to work. Many came back after the war, but at least one member of the white family, that was from the first article, the white family had amassed a lot of wealth, but then the Civil War happened. It says, but at least one member of the white family settled in Richmond and became a respected small businessman there. It says Reconstruction brought many challenges, but that was post Civil War. In the South, it was called Reconstruction. All right. It says not least of which was the Israelite white family's quandary over whether to remain in the biracial Baptist church they had helped to found, or to move with most other blacks into one of the newly formed all-black congregations. Okay. Phil White's sons made different decisions. Curtis stayed with the church of which his father had been one of the first two members. Curtis White had good reason to feel that the institution rightly belonged to him as much as any white person. Brother Caesar, meanwhile, became a trustee of the town's new Baptist congregation. It says, with all the changes Israel Hill underwent during and after the Civil War, it remained an essentially unified, vigorous community until well in the 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois published a social study of the blacks of Farmville and Israel Hill in 1898, in which he found that a strong black middle class had emerged in both places, while other residents did less well. I had the honor of interviewing two vulnerable women who grew up on Israel Hill in the 1910s and 1920s. They remembered a sizable, comfortable settlement with a strong spirit of community. All right. So basically, the Civil War, it kind of broke that community up, you know. And you had a lot more white people moving in and building businesses and churches and all of that. So, you know, but it wasn't a promised land. Okay, it wasn't the land that the Lord had promised us in the scriptures. All right, but that's just some history, man. You know, going into oh, and by the way, I I had got this link from a brother. He had posted some info on one of the comment boards, and you know, it intrigued me. So the spirit was on me to do a video on it, and I was inspired through the spirit to do a video on it. So I want to say the water to that brother. I can't really remember exactly who it was, but the water. Um, but that's basically it. It's just some history of the Israelites. Um, you know, on this Israel Hill on the Appomattox in Virginia. So with that, I'm ended there. I'm gonna give all praise and glory and honor to Yahweh by Hashem Yahushai. Double honors to the apostles, a great millstone. Peace and blessings and honors to the elect brothers. It's pushing this truth. Um, Lord willing, I'll see you on the next lesson, the next video. Shalom.